June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed his binoculars against the concrete observation slit of his bunker, watching what appeared to be an impossible sight unfolding on the blood-soaked sand below. Through the morning haze and smoke of battle, massive gray vessels were driving themselves directly onto the beach like beached whales, their enormous mouths opening to disgorge fully operational Sherman tanks straight onto the Normandy coastline. Weber had been fighting for the Wehrmacht since 1941, had witnessed the mechanized fury of Operation Barbarossa, had seen German engineering push the boundaries of warfare itself, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, when American industrial ingenuity would shatter every assumption about amphibious warfare that European military minds had held for centuries. The mathematics of what Weber was witnessing defied everything the German High Command believed about Allied capabilities. These weren't ordinary landing craft requiring deep water ports or elaborate dock facilities. These were LSTs, landing ship tanks, floating bridges between ship and shore that could deposit 30 tanks and 160 troops directly onto enemy beaches without requiring a single pier, crane, or harbor facility. The implications were staggering. If the Americans could land heavy armor anywhere along thousands of miles of European coastline, then every fortification, every defensive strategy, every carefully planned Atlantic wall position had become obsolete in a single morning. What Weber couldn't know, what none of the German defenders could have imagined, was that the ungainly vessels churning through the surf represented the most revolutionary advancement in amphibious warfare since the invention of the ship itself. The LST program had transformed American industrial capacity into a weapon that could project overwhelming force onto any beach on Earth. These weren't just ships. They were floating highways that connected the arsenal of democracy directly to Hitler's Fortress Europe. The story of how these remarkable vessels came to dominate the beaches of Normandy begins not with naval architects or military planners, but with a simple recognition that traditional amphibious warfare was fundamentally broken. Throughout history, armies attempting beach assaults faced an impossible dilemma. Light infantry could reach the shore quickly, but lacked the firepower to overcome fortified positions. Heavy equipment that could break through defenses required ports and harbors to land, facilities that would obviously be heavily defended or destroyed by retreating enemies. The British learned this lesson the hard way at Gallipoli in 1915, where tens of thousands of soldiers died attempting to storm beaches with rifles against machine gun nests. The Germans would face similar challenges when they canceled Operation Sea Lion, recognizing that landing on British beaches without heavy equipment was suicide, while landing with heavy equipment was impossible given existing technology. But American engineers approached this problem with characteristic directness. If traditional landing craft couldn't deliver tanks to beaches, then they would build landing craft that could. If existing naval architecture couldn't handle the requirements, then they would invent entirely new types of ships. The solution they developed would horrify naval traditionalists and amaze military historians in equal measure. The LST concept emerged from desperate necessity in early 1942. American planners studying potential invasion sites across the Pacific and Atlantic realized that every major operation would require capturing heavily defended beaches. Waiting to build up forces after securing ports would give enemies time to reinforce and counterattack. The only solution was to land overwhelming force immediately, which meant getting tanks, artillery, and supplies directly onto sand within hours of the initial assault. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself recognized the revolutionary potential of this concept. In a letter to President Roosevelt in February 1942, he wrote that the ability to land tanks directly on beaches would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the war. No longer would amphibious operations be limited to lightly defended areas near friendly ports. Any coastline on Earth could become a potential invasion site. The engineering challenges seemed impossible. Traditional ships required deep water to operate their propellers and rudders. Beaches meant shallow water, sandbars, and tidal variations that could strand conventional vessels. The Americans needed to design ships that could cross oceans like traditional vessels, but also function as floating bridges in just feet of water. They needed vessels that could carry the weight of 30 tanks while still maintaining the speed to avoid submarine attacks during transoceanic voyages. The solution came from an unlikely source. British naval architects had been experimenting with shallow draft vessels for river operations, while American engineers had developed innovative propulsion systems for Great Lakes shipping. Combining these technologies with mass production techniques that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing, American shipyards began producing vessels that veteran naval officers insisted couldn't possibly work. The LST design violated every principle of traditional naval architecture. At 328 feet long but drawing only 14 feet of water when loaded, these ships looked like floating warehouses rather than proper vessels. Their flat bottoms made them roll sickeningly in heavy seas. Their enormous bow doors created structural weaknesses that worried engineers. Their ballast systems were so complex that crews needed weeks of training just to understand basic operations. Yet somehow, these ungainly vessels worked better than anyone had dared hope. The first LSTs rolled off American production lines in October 1942, just 8 months after the initial design specifications were approved. By January 1943, these revolutionary vessels were proving their worth in combat conditions that would have destroyed conventional landing craft. The first major test came during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. German and Italian defenders watched in stunned disbelief as LSTs drove directly onto Sicilian beaches, their massive bow doors dropping like drawbridges to release columns of Sherman tanks that immediately engaged coastal fortifications. What had taken hours or days in previous amphibious operations now happened in minutes. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division's coastal defenses, filed a report that would circulate through German high command with alarming implications. The American landing ships, he wrote, had eliminated the traditional advantages of defensive positions. German artillery had been pre-sighted to target the approaches to existing ports and harbors. Anti-tank obstacles had been positioned to channel enemy armor into killing zones near dock facilities. The entire defensive strategy of Fortress Europe assumed that heavy Allied equipment would have to come ashore at predictable locations. The LSTs made these assumptions worthless. American tanks were appearing on beaches that German planners had considered impossible landing sites. Defensive positions designed to control harbor approaches found themselves bypassed entirely as Allied armor rolled directly off ships onto sand. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Soldiers who had been confident in their fortifications suddenly realized that American industrial capacity had rendered their positions obsolete. What made the LST even more revolutionary was its flexibility in combat operations. These vessels could adapt to battlefield conditions in ways that traditional ships never could. Their shallow draft allowed them to approach beaches at high tide and remain functional even as water levels dropped. Their powerful winches could extract themselves from sandbars or assist other stranded vessels. Most importantly, their design allowed them to unload and reload multiple times during a single operation. During the Anzio landings in January 1944, German forces witnessed this adaptability firsthand. LSTs would discharge their cargo, back off the beach, and return within hours carrying fresh supplies, reinforcements, or equipment. Some vessels made 3 complete loading cycles in a single day, delivering more material to the beachhead than entire convoys could have managed using traditional methods. German artillery observers reported that destroying individual LSTs had minimal impact because others immediately took their place. The production statistics told the story of American industrial supremacy that German intelligence found almost impossible to believe. By mid-1944, American shipyards were completing LSTs at a rate of one every other day. The vessels required 250,000 individual parts manufactured by suppliers across 43 states. Each LST consumed 1,200 tons of steel, enough to build 20 medium tanks. Yet American production was so efficient that these massive ships cost less than a single heavy bomber. German naval experts studying captured LST blueprints were astounded by the engineering solutions American designers had developed. The ballast system allowed crews to adjust the ship's trim precisely, ensuring optimal beaching angles on different types of shoreline. The propulsion arrangement used twin screws in protective tunnels, preventing damage from sand and debris while maintaining maneuverability in shallow water. The bow door mechanism could withstand the stress of beaching operations while still providing watertight integrity during ocean crossings. Perhaps most impressive was the LST's ability to carry mixed loads that traditional military transport had never achieved. A single vessel could simultaneously transport tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and troops. The cavernous tank deck could accommodate virtually any piece of equipment in the American arsenal. The upper deck provided space for additional vehicles or cargo. Crew quarters and passenger accommodations allowed for extended voyages with minimal resupply. The versatility of LST operations extended far beyond simple beach assaults. These vessels served as floating hospitals, moving wounded soldiers from beachheads to hospital ships offshore. They functioned as mobile repair shops, their spacious interiors allowing maintenance crews to work on damaged equipment. Some LSTs were converted into floating barracks, providing accommodation for troops during extended operations. Others became ammunition ships, delivering ordnance directly to fighting units without requiring intermediate storage facilities. German defenders along the Atlantic Wall began reporting a new type of anxiety among coastal troops. The knowledge that American LSTs could appear anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline made every position feel vulnerable. Traditional defensive planning had focused on protecting likely invasion routes and major ports. Now, every beach, every cove, every stretch of sand became a potential landing site for overwhelming Allied force. The psychological warfare aspect of LST operations proved as valuable as their tactical capabilities. German propaganda had spent years convincing troops that American industrial capacity was inferior to German engineering. The sight of these massive vessels operating successfully in conditions that would challenge any ship shattered these illusions completely. Back on Omaha Beach, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber lowered his binoculars as another LST ground its hull against the sand, bow doors swinging open like the jaws of some mechanical leviathan. Sherman tanks rolled directly onto French soil, their tracks finding purchase on sand that should have been their grave. The mathematics of amphibious warfare had been rewritten in a single morning by American industrial genius that turned the impossible into inevitable. Weber understood then what his commanders would spend months refusing to accept. The Atlantic Wall, that magnificent feat of concrete and steel stretching across occupied Europe, had become obsolete the moment these ungainly vessels proved they could deliver overwhelming force to any beach on Earth. German defensive strategy had prepared for attacks on ports and harbors, not for floating highways that eliminated the need for such facilities entirely. The LST represented more than revolutionary naval architecture. It embodied the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to warfare. While German engineers pursued perfection through complexity, American designers achieved superiority through practical innovation and mass production. These vessels that looked like floating warehouses had accomplished what no amount of tactical brilliance could match. They had made every coastline in the world a potential invasion site. The shock that German defenders experienced witnessing tanks roll directly from ships onto sand would echo through military thinking for generations. The LST had proven that American industrial capacity wasn't just about building more weapons, but about building weapons that changed the rules of war itself.